Well, hello, everyone. Good evening. And as always, for those out on the West Coast, good afternoon. Glad you're able to find time to come to the webinar this afternoon. I hope you're not skipping out on work at the last couple of minutes of the day. But welcome to the Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada's speaker series. As always, I am your host, Eric Story. I'm the outreach manager here at the Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada, as well as a PhD candidate in the Department of History at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario. Now, before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the extensive history of the land in which the Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada resides. Our office is located on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral peoples. In 1701, this land fell under the Dish with One Spoon Treaty between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, a treaty that was part of the Great Peace of Montreal in the same year that marked the end of the Beaver Wars of the 17th century. It represented and continues to represent today an eternal agreement to not only share and protect resources, but also solve conflicts peacefully. 80-some years later, in 1784, the Haldimand Proclamation was signed between the Haudenosaunee and the British Crown following the American Revolution, and the Haudenosaunee were given a tract of land that extended 6 miles on either side of the Grand River, from its source just north of Orangeville today to Lake Erie. Despite being reduced to less than 5% of its original size, today, this treaty territory remains the homeland of Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee communities, as well as the home of many Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island. Acknowledging their presence and relationship to the land in the past and present reminds us that these nations remain the original stewards of the lands and waters upon which the Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada resides, and the role we all should play as treaty people. Now, as many of you will know, we traditionally host talks on military history, but given that the center has a new and expanded mandate beyond just military history, I thought tonight might be an opportunity for us to speak to one of the many problems currently confronting Canada and the world in regards to the COVID-19 pandemic. And here's the problem, one of the many problems anyways, as I see it. Throughout the pandemic, I have found a tendency amongst the media, government officials, and even regular folks, and I certainly don't exclude myself from this group, of directing their frustrations with this pandemic at individual people for their individual choices. And while sometimes these accusations might be fair, I think they often leave the institutions that are often far more deserving of criticism and actually able to remedy these problems in the first place completely off the hook. And that's actually why I invited our guest to speak to you tonight, to speak to several of these kind of institutional problems or systemic issues that have been highlighted by the pandemic, but are certainly were not created by the pandemic, to help us better understand how and why we have collectively responded to the COVID-19 pandemic in the ways that we have, how we might respond to them, or how we might respond to future pandemics or public health emergencies. And perhaps most importantly of all, how we might identify and address some of the problems we have faced during this pandemic. And so when I was thinking of all of the folks that I might invite to speak to you tonight, I came across a philosophy professor at the University of Guelph named Maya Goldenberg. She's an associate professor there, and her research focuses on the philosophy of science and medicine. And she just recently authored a book called or titled Vaccine Hesitancy: Public Trust, Expertise, and the War on Science, which was published with the University of Pittsburgh Press just last year. And I thought that she would be the perfect person to help us understand some of these problems and help provide us with some tools so that we can confront and address them in the future. So tonight, Dr. Maya Goldenberg's talk, Is There a War on Science, is based upon that book, vaccine hesitancy. And we have it available for you all at 30% off. And I will share the link as well as the discount code that you will use in order to get that 30% discount shortly. But before I do, and before I turn it over to Dr. Goldenberg, I just have two quick housekeeping remarks. First of all, if any of you are seeing the closed captioning at the bottom of your screen and you're finding it perhaps a little bit distracting, you can just go down to the bottom of the window and click the CC button, and you can toggle closed captioning on and off as you wish. And secondly, what I would really encourage you to do is, at any point during the talk tonight, if a question comes to you, please enter it into the Q&A, again, at the bottom of your window. It won't distract Dr. Goldenberg. It won't kind of distract the talk tonight or distract from the talk, but it will allow you to fully pay attention to what Dr. Goldenberg is saying, so you don't have that question kind of lingering at the back of your mind. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Goldenberg for her talk tonight, where she is going to answer the question, is there a war on science? Dr. Goldenberg, why don't you take things away?
Thank you for that very nice introduction, Eric, and thank you to all members of the audience for joining us, for coming here to discuss this question, is there a war on science, to hear what I had to say, and I look forward to interacting and engaging at the question period. So let me begin with the question, is there a war on science? It is a very popular view that there is a war on science. On your screen, you see one articulation of this view. This came out in 2017 by Jonathan Foley. He's an environmental scientist and a public speaker, and he wrote somberly in Scientific American, Make no mistake, there is a war on science in America. The attack on science and on knowledge itself goes beyond anything we have seen in America before. And it is not only dangerous to science, it is dangerous to our nation and the world. Tonight, I'm going to argue the opposite of that view. Drawing from my years of research into vaccine hesitancy, I'm going to argue against the idea that there's a war on science. When you think about parents who don't want to vaccinate their kids, that was my area of research. Did most of my research for this book before COVID even existed. So when you think about parents who don't want to vaccinate their kids, the controversy certainly looks warlike. And COVID vaccine hesitancy looks even more so, with downtown Ottawa under siege, as well as the blockades at the Canadian-US border until recently. You can see why the description, a war on science, seems compelling to a lot of people. Still, I'm going to argue that this is not a war on science. There is something else going on, and I think it's better called a crisis of trust. So before COVID, when I started my research into vaccine hesitancy, childhood vaccinations was the big issue regarding people who don't take up and people who refuse vaccines for their children. And that's where my own research began. And I was specifically looking at the situation in industrialized nations like our own. It presents this puzzle against this strong scientific consensus on vaccines, consistent messaging from public health, and relatively good access to vaccines for Canadians. Vaccine hesitancy still persists. So when I started this research, I wanted to figure out what evidence was going to convince them. And the answer to this question, what evidence is going to convince them, turned out to be more complicated than I thought. In fact, I was asking the wrong question. And that's when the work got really interesting. If vaccine hesitancy isn't some information problem or a communication problem, what is it? So let me first define the term. I will go on to answer that, but let me first define vaccine hesitancy, just to make sure we're working with the same thinking on this. It is, vaccine hesitancy is a feeling of ambivalence about vaccines or about vaccination. It's an attitude. It is not a behavior. The behavior of interest might be vaccine refusal, but we're talking about the attitude or the feelings about it. Vaccine hesitancy can certainly predict behavior, but it does not guarantee it. Some people hesitate and they still vaccinate their kids. Others hesitate and refuse all vaccines. And many parents try to do some kind of modified schedule where they choose some vaccines for their kids, but they skip others. Maybe they space them out longer or start them out when their children are older. Generally, public health scholars agree that we need to keep an eye on the attitude, not just the behavior, in order to protect public health. And I'd say vaccine hesitancy became an area of research interest about 10 years ago. There was sort of that consensus that we need to look at the attitude, not just look at the rates of refusal. So what I would like to do today is challenge the way we usually think about or how we frame vaccine hesitancy and refusal. Frameworks, of course, are important. They structure how we view the problem and how we respond to it. So we're going to look at the assumptions and the values lying beneath the dominant framework, which I will call the war on science. That is the dominant framework for the way most people think about vaccine hesitancy. I'm going to go through those values and assumptions, assess them and their impact, and I'm going to suggest a new framework that I think works better, which I call a crisis of trust. So let's start with this. Let's think about how should we understand public resistance and controversy over scientific claims. So I'm thinking about resistance to strong scientific consensus, or even if not a full consensus, but strong scientific or expert opinion on things like the safety and efficacy of pediatric vaccines. But you might have another example in mind. The climate change controversy is another example of this. GMO opposition goes against a strong scientific consensus that genetically modified foods are generally safe. And there are more. And these controversies, these kind of hot button scientific based controversies, are usually framed in the media, in our discourses, in combative terms. And the combatants are science versus nonsense, reason versus ignorance, expertise versus non-expertise. And we generally hear that science and rationality and expertise are losing the war. The victims of war, of course, are our health and well-being as a result. And who is responsible for this loss? It is members of the public, at least some of them. When some members of the public turn away from science and rationality by refusing vaccination or by deprioritizing political action on climate change, they fail at the task of informed democratic participation. That is the dominant view. And you'll find lots of examples of this view in many forms of media that are paying attention to this vexing problem of public controversies over scientific claims. In my own research, I looked at academic work on this subject, popular science writing, many opinion pieces in newspapers and magazines, and I noticed there were some very common themes in how people characterized the problem. One was commentators bemoaning science illiteracy among the general public. So people would point to science illiteracy as the problem. Another one was the end of expertise. It was commentators fretting over a destructive cultural embracing of anti-intellectualism and, of course, the end of expertise. That's the idea that no one listens to experts anymore. These are very common themes in the discussions regarding public resistance to scientific claims. So I saw them again and again in the readings that I did. And this resistance towards even very strong scientific consensus claims are seen as a key problem of our times. We are now allegedly post-truth, we are post-fact, we are anti-science, and of course the culture war on science and expertise only gets amplified when you add a pandemic. COVID-19 was described in this article as our first post-truth pandemic. This idea that facts and science and truth doesn't matter anymore. it's some kind of free-for-all in trying to get a grip on ideas. Okay, so what's being described here as a whole is a culture war on science and expertise. It's taking place on social media platforms, and of course, it is impacting all of us. So that is the dominant framework I want to challenge regarding vaccine hesitancy and public resistance to scientific claims more generally. So returning to that previous division I showed you, I'm going to argue this is not a war on science and expertise. I'll acknowledge that it is very tempting to see it that way when members of the public repeat pseudoscience that they picked up on the internet, when people don't listen to their doctors about vaccines. But I'm going to make a case for an alternative framework to the war on science, which is a crisis of trust, specifically public mistrust of scientific institutions, whether that is research institutions or institutions of scientific governance, like public health institutions. And this alternative framework, the crisis of trust, rests on a different conception of the relationship between science and society. What I mean is, what is this thing called science? What do we mean when we say science? And how do the public relate to science? And this differently posited relationship will encourage different public health outreach strategies. It will also redraw the lines of moral responsibility for this problem, as I'm going to show that the problem doesn't lie squarely with the epistemic failings of the public. So with all that, let's start looking into this alleged war on science with what is assumed in this framework to be the nature of science. What is science? Now, this question, what is science, is a little bit abstract. It can be answered many ways. And any answer to this abstract question needs to reflect some kind of purpose. What is science supposed to do? The question about the nature of science for our purpose is vis-a-vis its relationship to the public and to policy. So I want to get a little more precise on this question of what is science and ask specifically, what is the role of science in liberal decision-making? That's our interest here. And I'm going to answer this question with the image that's on your screen. So back to our war on science framework. Whether you think the driver of vaccine hesitancy is the public's low scientific literacy or some kind of willful science denialism and anti-expertise, these explanations share something in common, and it is a grounding assumption about the role of science in democratic decision-making. In both accounts, there's this thing called science that transcends partisan politics, and a failure to recognize this rightful anchor in liberal democracies is extremely damaging. So I use this image here of a boat and an anchor to capture the assumed role of science in democratic societies. Science provides the anchor for the swells and surges of democratic choice. It rationalizes majority rule. So public misunderstanding and the death of expertise are similar and similarly problematic in that they are thought to untether decision-making from its rational basis. So whether it's a war on evidence or a war on experts, public resistance to scientific claims are similarly envisioned. It's a battle between established knowledge and everything else. And like Jonathan Foley, our environmental scientist that I started with, like he said in that Scientific American blog post, it's not only dangerous to science, it is dangerous to our nation and the world. So the stakes couldn't be higher. No wonder people like to frame it as a war. Public health organizations often, let's say usually, have good scientific backing for their directives. It is then assumed to follow that public health has exclusive claim to knowledge and rational policy. It's also assumed that the problem lies in those who cannot appreciate the science and science-backed policies. That's kind of the thinking through the war on science here. And whether that's about vaccine hesitancy or other forms of public pushback against scientifically backed policies. Now, I'm going to agree to the scientific superiority of the vaccine consensus view, but I am going to challenge the other claims that the best policies follow from the best science and that the public are the problem. So I've said it already, but I'll say it again. I am arguing against a popular and admittedly tempting way of thinking about controversies over well-established scientific claims. Disagreements over the safety of vaccines, for example, as a war of scientific evidence. This is, as I mentioned, a common perception, common enough to make the cover of National Geographic magazine and repeated often in the media, even repeated in recent years by political leaders who feel the need to declare allegiance to science. I'll start with the current ones and go back a little bit. Joe Biden, he ran for US president on a pro-science campaign, saying science is back when he made it to the presidency. This was, of course, was one way of distancing himself from his Republican opponent, but he was not the first to do this. He was not the first political leader to say, to declare allegiance to science as if it was a political option for them and not just, science itself. I'll give a few examples. This is the former head of the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. He, in his inaugural speech in 2019, he tearily vowed to uphold science. 3 years earlier, Hillary Clinton accepted the Democratic Party nomination and told the Democratic National Congress that she believes in science. And she had taken that phrase and the cue from Barack Obama before her, who had worked the phrase, "I believe in science," into his inaugural speech when he became president of the United States. And the public loved how he positioned himself in contrast to the outgoing president, who was George W. Bush, who was then thought of as America's most anti-science president. He's been demoted to second place since then. And of course, our own prime minister similarly expressed allegiance to science upon taking office in 2015. He even installed a new ministerial position, the Minister of Science. And by doing that, he distanced himself from the outgoing Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, who is remembered as our most anti-science Prime Minister. So believing in science is now the language of Democrats and liberals. So both conservatives and liberals, it seems, contribute to a reframing of science as partisan. Science, as you will recall, is supposed to ground politics as the anchor, not be the divide. So it's important to note that this partisanship invites ideological conflict over scientific claims, and we are getting this. It's worked. Public polls polling people on their trust in science demonstrate this. We see people on the political left speaking very highly and expressing high public trust in science versus conservatives, people on the political right, expressing far less. Canadians are not as bifurcated as Americans are on this issue, but we could go there. We could. So I say this view of public resistance to scientific claims as a war on science. I mentioned already that it is tempting to see it that way because the description seems to fit, partly because our leadership are actually creating this fit, but also because of what's actually going on in how science plays out in the public stage. We've got these controversies where we have often a huge body of literature supporting a scientific consensus. That's the case on climate change. That's the case on pediatric vaccines. Then we have opponents who pick out selective and often disreputable counter evidence. The publics are then caught in the middle, sometimes choose wrongly. And the reason for public resistance to scientific claims, whether on vaccines or climate change, is then argued to be what it looks like. The public misunderstands the science. They lack scientific literacy. And popular science communicators like Neil deGrasse Tyson, probably our most famous English language science communicators, they strongly endorse this view. Science illiteracy is a tragedy of our times, says Neil deGrasse Tyson in this image on your screen, and he's said that many times. Science communications aimed at the public, let's say to educate them on climate issues or on getting vaccines, science communications, as a result, they tend to focus on this perceived science illiteracy problem. They focus on transmitting knowledge to the public, especially debunking myths and providing the facts. This effort is being made to educate the public, who are presumed to be uneducated or lacking proper education. It's supposed to correct scientific illiteracy that way. So they assume science illiteracy problem is the problem, and they try to fix it with these fact-based communications. Now, parents, of course, do seem to be rejecting science when they explain their reasons for hesitating about vaccines. There is lots of survey work, interview transcripts, online forums where parents say things like, vaccines are not safe, vaccines are not effective, vaccines are not necessary. So they make these evidentiary claims in direct contradiction to the consistent message being offered by their physicians, by public health agencies, by scientists, and so on. So the framework, this idea that they are scientifically illiterate and maybe there is a war on science, does seem compelling. Still, there is a strong reason to challenge the pervasive explanation that the public doesn't understand the science. First is that if misunderstanding and misinterpretation of the scientific evidence were the problem, you would expect the providing corrective information to fix the problem, but it doesn't. This is kind of well known when I tell you this, that there's been years of well-funded education campaigns where they give you the facts, they bust myths, they tell us what the consensus is on vaccines, for example, and that has not changed the number of skeptics. The number of vaccine refusers still pretty low in Canada regarding pediatric vaccines. The number of refusers stay the same, and vaccine hesitancy numbers have actually been going up for years. Slowly, so maybe there is some corrective effort here, but it's certainly not turning the tide on vaccine hesitancy and refusal. Another reason to think poor science literacy is not the root of the problem is that vaccine hesitators are often well educated. Again, the social science research into pediatric vaccine hesitancy found higher rates of hesitancy among university degree holders, among parents with university degrees, even parents with postgraduate degrees. So the more likely story here is that those with higher education are putting their critical thinking skills to use. Some are going online and reading the scientific papers, and many more are allegedly reading between the lines to see what the establishment doesn't want us to see. So even if we allow for a few missteps in individual reasoning, where people cherry pick the data and ignore the bulk of it, where people misattribute correlation for causation, poor scientific literacy does not appear to be the key problem driving vaccine hesitancy. Now, mischaracterizing vaccine hesitators as scientifically illiterate does not amount to a war on science. But some explanations of vaccine hesitancy have taken it a little bit further. They go stronger than some presumed knowledge gap that may or may not be filled. There's a stronger view that proposes that education efforts have not lowered vaccine hesitancy because vaccine hesitators and refusers cannot be reasoned with. It's a lost cause, and therefore compulsion is the only way. So here you kind of see a little bit, something a little less benign than saying they don't understand. Now you're getting into character problems and lack of reasoning skills with those people, with the other who are vaccine refusers. The war on science has also been parsed out as the death of expertise. In the middle of your screen, you see a book by the political scientist Tom Nichols called The Death of Expertise. That's where this term comes from. Wrote this book in 2018, and it made it onto the New York Times bestsellers list. So apparently convincing was his position that no one listens to experts anymore. In the book, Nichols laments the realization of the Dunning-Kruger effect. the idea that the public think they know better than experts. And because of that, science denialism and irrationalism can then thrive. Now, I've kind of covered the popular science and the politics writing, popular politics writing, but what about the academic writing? I'll tell you a little bit about that. I looked specifically at science studies and science and technology studies, because this is the area of research that looks at the very questions that I'm asking about the nature of science, its relationship to society, and of course, the status of scientific expertise. In this area of study, many scholars still take up some form of the narrative of science denialism and the public embrace of irrationalism. And that is consistent with the war on science framework. It is still a pointing at the public as the problem, for having all kinds of cognitive and maybe moral flaws that lead them in the wrong direction. So I'm going to illustrate this point by discussing a little bit of the work by sociologists Harry Collins and Robert Evans. They wrote this book called Rethinking Expertise to address the very problem of the downgrading of experts in society. This came out in 2008. They describe in the introduction to the book this troubling societal trend towards a distrust of experts. And Collins then wrote a popular science book called Are We All Scientific Experts Now in 2014, and it rehashes some of the arguments from the 2008 book. And in that second book, he coined the phrase default expertise, which is a useful concept for us. It is the problematic idea that everyone is an expert or no one is an expert. Instead, we've got some kind of leveling of the intellectual terrain where there are no experts, there are no non-experts. It's just us with our equally valid points of view. Kind of everyone's got a point. So a little more on default expertise. That idea, default expertise, is meant to describe, I'll quote him here, the sense of empowerment, the sense that every citizen is part of the game of science and technology. It's the feeling of having the right to judge, and apparently ordinary citizens think they possess this because science and technology are so fallible. Default expertise is supposed to explain the apparent reasonableness of telling worried parents to do the research and decide for yourself, and the energy with which sudden vaccine hesitant parents take up that challenge. Now, Collins wants to save sociology of science as much as he wants to save expertise. So he plies his trade to provide a response to those armchair researchers, those default experts investigating pediatric vaccines online. So what he does is he draws from the periodic table of expertises. That's not a typo, that's what they called it. So what you see on your screen here is a table that was developed by Collins and Evans, detailing the many kinds of expertise that are out there. And he focuses on the contrast between two key kinds of expertise that he thinks is leading us to confusion and leading armchair researchers to think that they are somehow experts on vaccines. So they're circled on your screen. There's primary source knowledge, and there is interactional expertise. Primary source knowledge gives you the kind of expertise of an informed non-specialist who reads the scientific papers. So parents who read the primary sources can gain the status of primary source knowledge. Interactional expertise is a little bit higher. It is specialist expertise. It is the knowledge and understanding that comes from being part of the specialist community. It's being a scientist in a community of vaccine researchers. So a parent who is well read because they access scientific papers, they can have this primary source knowledge expertise on vaccines, but they do not have interactional expertise. That is different. Only members of the relevant expert community have that kind of expertise. And only this expertise gives you the kind of specialist knowledge that you need to be an expert on the subject. It gives you specialist tacit knowledge. That's what makes you an expert, and that makes you a specialist. So the upshot, just to draw this out, according to Collins, is you can read all the stuff you want, read all the online stuff you want, and even read the professional scientific literature from the perspective of an outsider or an amateur. You'll absorb a lot of information, but you'll still never have interactional expertise. That's the sort of expertise developed by getting to know a community of scientists intimately and getting a feeling for what they think. That's a very sociologist way of framing scientific involvement. I'll explain a little more. Collins says that if you only get your information from the journals, you can't tell whether a paper is being taken seriously by the scientific community or not. You cannot get a good picture of what is going on in science from the literature alone. So Collins' answer to the question, are we all scientific experts now, is no. Interactional expertise is the key concept here. Even if every one of us are an expert on some things, that doesn't give us specialist knowledge on everything or for everyone. Vaccine skeptics will often insist that they are experts on their children, and they use that to justify why they make claims about vaccines. I'm an expert on my child. Sure, says Collins, but that doesn't make you an expert on vaccines. Specialist knowledge arises from, of course, education and from the work and from immersion in a community of experts. Best to leave the judgments of vaccine safety and efficacy to the scientists. So this is how these leading sociologists of expertise work to reclaim expertise, to save it from its death or its demise. They tell us that scientists could do better in their communications with the public and in policing occasional transgressions in their fields, like scientific fraud or other types of misrepresentation. But the heart of the problem, the death of expertise that we are witnessing in society, lies in the public's confusion about the nature of expertise. If the public can come to understand that we are not all scientific experts, expertise will be restored and public controversy over scientific claims can end. So in this argument for the special nature of interactional expertise is an important acknowledgement, and it is that knowledge arises in community. And this idea that knowledge is social, that science is social knowledge, is very important. I think Collins' acknowledgement of the social nature of scientific knowledge, this idea that we learn from each other and create collective knowledge, I think it's right, but I think he doesn't take it far enough. A key feature of this communal exercise that we call knowledge building or creating knowledge, a key feature of it is trust. And that is the case because all relationships are built on trust. We need to attend to the ways trust figures into this social exercise of generating knowledge. And that gets me to my preferred framework, which I called the crisis of trust. So I want to take this picture of the social nature of knowledge, something that Collins and other sociologists of expertise confidently subscribe to. I want to take it in different directions. And this is going to allow me to characterize public resistance to science and the so-called death of expertise somewhat differently. I'm going to say it is not a move towards irrationality. It is not a reflection of scientific misunderstanding or really a war on anything, but rather a reflection of societal mistrust of scientific institutions. To make the case that the problem is poor trust and not poor appreciation or poor understanding of science, I'll need to demonstrate the ways in which science and trust are linked. So I'm going to present trust as important to science, even endemic to science. Trust plays a role in how knowledge is created within scientific communities, how dissent and disagreement is managed, and how consensus is built, and how the consensus is legitimated. Poor trust relationships, on the other hand, undermine scientific practice and policy. And vaccine hesitancy, I'll show, is a symptom of a lack of trust or a trust deficit, specifically poor public trust in these scientific institutions and the work they do. Because these institutions, scientific and medical institutions, need public trust to achieve their aims and their goals, public resistance to scientific claims is not squarely a problem with the public, but rather a problem with scientific governance. I'm going to argue that and show that it invites new ways of addressing vaccine hesitancy and other forms of public resistance to scientific claims. I first want to say what we mean by trust here. We need a definition here. It is a heavily theorized concept. I'm going to give the short version of it. If you read in ethics and philosophy of science, in social theory, there's a lot of work on trust, in social psychology as well. And the concept of trust is taken to mean having confidence in someone or something. So you can trust in a thing. It doesn't need to just be a person. And discussions about trust in science, when we talk about trust in the context of science, we're usually referring to something called epistemic trust. To invest epistemic trust in someone is to trust them as a provider of knowledge. That's what epistemic trust is. So when we trust a person or an organization or an institution, we're judging them to be dependable and worthy of our confidence. Now, epistemic trust is more than just reliance on someone. It's the kind of dependence that makes the trusting person dependent on the trustee's goodwill. We trust them to have good intention, in other words. This dependency on others people's goodwill makes us vulnerable. We may be misled and we may be harmed by that person. So trusting others is inherently risky, but it is also unavoidable since there's so much that we don't know. And that tension between needing to trust, but being made vulnerable by doing that, the risk associated with it, it makes trust good for ethical analysis. So there's, of course, tons of ethics of trust. So when we find ourselves in situations where we lack adequate information to know for ourselves, and this happens all the time, of course, we need to trust others. We know the risk that trust may be broken. We need to do something in order to get past it. We need to do what's been described, or I should say, trust requires what's been described in the sociology literature as leaps of faith. And that leap refers to some kind of bridging of an information gap in situations of risk. We don't know exactly how this is going to go, but at some point we have to take that leap. So epistemically dependent people will fill that knowledge gap with some kind of suspension or bracketing off of uncertainties and take that leap. Now, the confidence with which the truster leaps is captured in the expectation of that expert's goodwill. Or maybe, sorry, I'm going ahead a little bit, or maybe moral integrity is enough. But it is some kind of characterization of the expert that we need to think they're a good person in some way. There's this expectation that they will be properly motivated to act, whether in our interest or for society's good or something like that. So our confidence in information providers hinges not just on their epistemic credentials, which is the letters they have next to their name, a PhD, an MD, whatever, but our confidence will hinge also on our perception of their moral character. Are they good people that will report honestly and work in the public interest, including my own interest? And there's been qualitative research into parental decision-making regarding pediatric vaccines that has highlighted the multiple leaps of faith taken in the face of incomplete knowledge and, of course, anxiety over the future. How is my kid going to respond to vaccines? Parents' trusting leaps are taken, and sometimes they are denied regarding vaccine advice from relations of familiarity. That can be from your peers, from family members, from health professionals. Even the scientific bodies that those professionals represent are going to figure into who you know and who you trust. So trust is thereby understood to be a means of social cohesion. They bring people together and connect people through our emotional ties or our affective commitments is another way of saying emotional ties. So what's important for our discussion is that it is not the growing mountain of data that are convincing parents to vaccinate their children. Rather, it is a willing leap in favor of the scientific consensus. Logic and arguments will surely play a part, but the leftovers, the gaps in what we know and what we don't know, those are filled with that trusting leap. Vaccine hesitators and refusers, they situate themselves in different spheres of familiarity that disqualify the scientific majority view on vaccines. So what's worth noticing here is there is actually, by this characterization, there's a symmetry between the two. It is not the case that one side is informed and knows science and the other side is uninformed. Instead, parents make these calculations. They move towards in-group belonging. They generally do what their peers do. And this social exercise of in-group belonging is not well explained by cognitivist accounts of risk and risk assessment. Instead, trust is cognitive. There is, some attention to the facts, but there's also affective and cognitive dimensions. That means that it's done with purpose. In this case, the purpose is to hold on to relationships that we care about. So that's what we mean by trust. Now I'll say a little bit about how trust figures into science. Science, of course, is thought to be rigorous by being wary of trust. The popular view is science is done well when we don't listen to authority, we examine the evidence for ourselves. So this popular understanding of science made an alternative thesis that came out of science studies starting around the 1980s very radical. The idea was trust relations make scientific progress possible. So this went against the Enlightenment ideals of epistemic individualism, where you study for yourself, and radical skepticism, where you trust no one. And instead, a compelling case was made for trust and epistemic dependency being the norm in science. And that's how science works. Scientists trust in the peer-reviewed knowledge that support their own work. They trust their collaborators to do each of their own piece of the project properly. And no one has the time or expertise to do all the work themselves, to do independent science for the most part, or to check every one of their colleagues' claims. This is not to say that hard data and logical arguments are not necessary, but since not every scientist can do the singular effort of testing each claim, much of what we call science and what we consider scientific knowledge is built on these trusting relationships. Trust in the peer review process, trust in your collaborators, that kind of thing. So against that kind of idyllic lone genius image, which is captured at the bottom right, that image on your screen, science today is a collaborative exercise, more like the other image here. And relationships of trust operate between the actors and between actors and the institutions. Most of the time, those trust relationships are acting invisibly, and they are what keeps science going. So that's the relationship between trust and science. It's happening behind the scenes. Trust is establishing and legitimating knowledge as true and universal and scientific. Now, if you leave the scientific community and think about the public stage where science and the public meet, of course, this is the site where our controversies take place, you've got a much different picture. Here, first of all, epistemic dependency and trust is more visible, it's more obvious, because members of the public rely on scientific knowledge to inform everyday choices and practices. And we do it all the time. We know as non-experts that we don't have the time and skill to check each claim for ourselves. And we look to experts to help us with this. How should I invest for retirement? Do I need to take an umbrella with me today? There is a great need for expertise and many people offering us expert advice. So when the channels of knowledge translation and knowledge mobilization work well, this move from expert advice to non-expert action can go very smoothly. But we're talking about vaccine hesitancy today because those relationships between experts and non-experts are not so secure. Members of the public are arguably well advised to defer to scientists with the relevant expertise. Those scientists have interactional expertise. It makes it likely that their judgments will be better than our own. So I think we all agree that the public benefits from well-placed trust in experts. We will know more if we follow the right experts and take information from them. The challenge for members of the public is knowing when and where that trust is well placed. The risk of harm remains. We might be misled by a sneaky or a conniving scientist. So people in the public sphere have ways to try to reduce that risk. We have ways to assess expert advice. We can't really assess the content of the scientific claims. If we could, we wouldn't need expert advice, but instead we can evaluate the character of the scientific expert or the integrity of the institutions they represent. That's what people do. Members of the public will follow advice if we trust those experts to be epistemically sound and morally responsible. So the reasonableness or the rationality of following expert advice hinges on trust and credibility. Experts must be trustworthy and non-experts must recognize them as such. That's what I mean by credibility. They need to be recognized as trustworthy. And so relations of trust are what mediate successful exchanges between scientific institutions and the public. Now, trust is, relations of trust don't preclude disagreement and controversy. We know in scientific communities that disagreement and dissent between its members is normal, and it's even encouraged. It's trust that keeps those disagreements from splintering things and making things fall apart. Trust is what helps us manage those disagreements and keep them contained. Philosophers of science think science works well when the public, when science is public and accountable to opposing views. So more dissent is a good thing for science. It improves the openness and the critical nature of science. So science communities need communicative practices to enable dissent. We need standards for its uptake, for how to engage with dissenting views. And there are some recommendations for how to do this. There's been recommendations to increase the diversity within scientific communities, more gender and racial and class diversity, because bringing in different perspectives will make dissent and criticism more wide-reaching. There's also the worry and the knowledge that dissent can be weaponized. For example, when industry-funded research disputes the climate change consensus. So dissent needs to be carefully monitored. We need to regulate dissent to make sure that what we are hearing and responding to are legitimate knowledge-seeking dissent rather than obstructionist or illegitimate dissent. So it's with all these communicative practices in place to make dissent bigger and better that robust scientific consensus can arise on some issues, while points of disagreement can still respectfully endure without rupturing community cohesion. Now compare this to public controversies over science. On the public stage, it is not so well managed. That's why we're here today talking about whether there's a war on science. We don't have comparable shared rules for the management of disagreement or for how to build consensus. We don't have shared frames of reference. Now we talk about facts and alternative facts, legitimate science versus junk science. Sometimes there are financial conflicts of interest on both sides of the debate. And as if those challenges were not enough, the heated science controversies that make it to the public stage usually aren't about science at all, but what follows practically from accepting the science is true. What I mean is people will argue about science, but what they're really worried about are the social implications of the science being taken as true. What policies will be put in place? How will they impact my livelihood and my sense of well-being? Science controversies then become proxy politics where we argue over science, sometimes over really technical issues like what is COVID's rate of reproduction or which models best represent surface temperature increases for climate analysis. But these arguments over the science are really placeholders for the values that are at stake. What follows from the science being taken as true? This can be a hard realization for some, that science cannot guide us to good policy and right action. Remember our initial framing of science, that's what it was supposed to do. Science was supposed to neutralize political partisanship and rationalize democratic decision-making by giving us the sort of foundational facts that we can build our politics and our policy on. So it is shocking to many vaccine advocates that the science consensus on vaccines does not settle public concern. Instead, we see it getting positioned as one side of a debate where scientific experts must insist on their legitimacy against what seems like disreputable opponents who claim to have science and moral credibility on their side. And we should appreciate that surprise. The consensus is supposed to do more than that. It's supposed to settle debate, not invite it. It represents the majority view of those who are most suited to pronounce on an issue. And consensus claims sometimes serve public function. They educate the publics on issues and in order to help us promote appropriate response. And the failure to achieve these aims is no doubt frustrating. And many will ask, doesn't the consensus deserve more deference? It is, after all, the best approximation of scientific truth. And the strength of its findings rest in the methods of consensus building. So for the public to suggest that consensus claims or strong scientific majority views are somehow impartial is to reject an elaborate set of epistemic, methodological, and institutional mechanisms that have been put in place to ensure reliable knowledge and public benefit from that knowledge. So science isn't supposed to be something that you believe in or are against, and to say otherwise is to say that science depends on trust. That is the frustration. But of course, science does depend on trust. I think I went back, sorry. Here's what's important. Much of what members of the public know about vaccines pivots on epistemic trust. They might read the literature for themselves, but they need the kind of expert source to give them context for understanding. Most of us do not have the skills to figure it all out by reading the scientific papers. The same applies to our beliefs about climate change. It's about epistemic trust. That is what situates our beliefs. So tied to these consensus statements and position papers by academic scientists are a claim to the trustworthiness of its authors and institutions they belong to, as both epistemically and moral legitimate. So tied to it is this idea that this is the source that you should put your trust in. Vaccine hesitators and more strident vaccine refusers reject those claims of legitimacy. So what is the appropriate response when the consensus does not fulfill its function of fostering public trust? Here's what happens now. Vaccine hesitators, vaccine refusers are ridiculed for raising concerns, for questioning expert testimony, for taking seriously minority dissenting opinions. The hashtag COVIDiots quickly became the term for anyone who resisted any public health measures during the pandemic. And against the democratic tenor of science that I was speaking, that is apparently so loved and cherished about science, now science journalists write articles like, "This is why you have no business challenging scientific experts," to convey sincere disgust over public pushback to science. Now, we know that the consensus on expert-generated directives made for epistemically dependent outsiders, for non-experts.
Maya, I think we've lost you. I think we have some a bit of a connection issue. Could you why don't you just quickly, could you sign out of the webinar and then sign back in and see if that fixes the problem?
Yeah, I'll do that.
Okay. Sorry about this, everybody. As we all know, Zoom problems at some point are going to play a role in these webinars. So we'll see if we can fix this up here. Thanks everybody for hanging in with us. We appreciate it. Is this where we were, Maya?
Keep going. I'll tell you when to stop.
Okay.
There's something, the slide said mechanism. Here it is. That was it. You can go back to that.
Okay.
Go back one to mechanisms.
There we
the
go.
one that said mechanism.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Yes. Thank you. Thanks.
No
okay, I'm back, and thanks for fixing that. Okay. So I was saying that that there are mechanisms that we have in place to ensure the trustworthiness of the scientific consensus that are in place, but they are largely shielded from public view. So there's this final step in the expert-lay exchange where, if all goes well, the public will accept the scientific consensus view, but to do that requires some degree of a trusting leap of faith again, that the scientific experts have done their due diligence and reported responsibly. The trust requirement places people outsiders in a vulnerable position because they don't get to see what's going on. And there's no sympathy for that. The publics are implored to trust science, trust in a process that is largely shielded from your view. So it's without an eye on or participation in these practices of scientific knowledge and consensus building, with additional threats of sanction if you don't accept the findings, that the publics are instructed to trust. And most of us are willing to do it, and some of us are just not. Next slide, please. So the current climate of decision-making on vaccines is difficult. There are many opinions out there. Many people don't know which side to believe. Other people do know what side to believe, but more as a matter of political expression rather than some kind of informed view. So it's due to poor trust that institutions that are tasked with protecting the public good are not able to carry out their efforts. Could you click that again, Eric? I think there's more text. The scientific consensus is not fulfilling its public function by guiding the parents and helping them be confident about vaccine choices. Next slide, please. There are institutional implications for what I just said. Everyone agrees that the public needs science, but my point is that it goes both ways. Science needs the public too. Many institutional goals, especially for policy relevant science like public health or climate science, it hinges on positive relations. Science wants to create universally applicable knowledge, and this knowledge is only universal if it is accepted by all of its stakeholders, and the public are one of the stakeholders. This places a demand on scientific communities to earn and maintain the trust of the public. So public health science, for example, is not able to do very much in order to improve population health if the general public do not accept its recommendations. These health recommendations and consensus claim bank on the public's trust in these institutions being conscientious and honest in their efforts. So having the best science is one thing, but you also have to do the work to make sure the public is on board. Your credibility is, your trustworthy is imperative, but so is your credibility. And I think persistent vaccine hesitancy tells us that there is an institutional failure to maintain good relationships with the public, or at least that they could be better. And that warrants self-reflection about institutional trust building practices. How much investment is there in maintaining positive relations with the public? Do these institutions' other relationships to government, to industry, do they help or hinder public trust? Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to bring it all together. And so I asked the question, is there a war on science? And to answer that question, we've been looking at the work that a war metaphor is doing for us here. How well does it frame the tension between science and society? Does it help us understand this tension? Does it shape response to the problem in a good way? I don't think the war on science is helpful, whether descriptively or prescriptively. Wars and battle metaphors frame issues in a certain way. They frame issues as us versus them and good versus evil. And that kind of framing minimizes the need to understand the perspective of the other or to find ways to live together. It allows it for minimal attention to how our own actions could even make the situation worse. For example, how ineffective vaccine communications can actually harden vaccine skeptical views. How when politicians double down on science as the decider, as scientists, as our soothsayers, it obscures important places where moral and political discussion is needed. And this move to say, but science, we are following the science, can frustrate and radicalize the supposedly anti-science base, who I would say were not anti-science, but have variety of moral and political concerns that do not get properly aired. Now, communications researchers looking at this issue explain that framing an issue as a battle directs people to choose sides and also directs people to try to vanquish their opponents. So wars happen because political negotiation and compromise have been exhausted, or in anticipation that deadlock is going to be the end point. So why the quick assumption in public health that we've reached this narrow end? That what we see now is so different from what we've encountered before, and that there's no turning back. There's no way to overcome this without war. That might have been the response, the right response, if the public really were scientifically informed to a point that they could not support a functional democracy. But I don't think there is evidence for this view. I've argued that the evidence most of the public accept on vaccines turns crucially on epistemic trust. So it's poor trust in expert sources that create vaccine hesitancy. In other words, consensus claims won't convince people if the source is not perceived as trustworthy. So what if focused on building that trust rather than educating the misinformed publics or puzzling over their moral and epistemic failings? Doing this, of course, doesn't discount the importance of good science, but it does mean that the best science isn't enough. The war on science, of course, assumed the best science is enough. It was science is supposed to be that firm anchor, mooring liberal democratic politics. But recognizing that science does not operate that way means that we need to rethink what function we think, what function science is playing here. The truth is scientific evidence is always subject to interpretation, so there's a room for disagreement there. Political and policy decisions include many other considerations than, let's say, the public health science. It can be monetary, ethical, legal, historical, and more. So when politicians insist they are following the science, they are obscuring those other considerations. And by doing so, they use science as a political tool to exonerate policies and to repudiate criticism. And that is problematic. The current tendency to criticize the skeptical publics for failing to appreciate the primacy of scientific reasoning, the authority of experts, it does not address the problem of public mistrust of scientific institutions. If anything, it exacerbates that mistrust by entrenching that polarizing us versus them mentality. So to close, good public trust between science and the public helps ensure that science stands prominently in policy frameworks. It diffuses the political gains from either scientistic rhetoric or from anti-science rhetoric. The common ground can and should be that science is useful for political debate, and also that science does not settle political issues. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Maya. Let me just get this PowerPoint out of here. I wonder if we could try quickly you turning your camera back on to see if you got the bandwidth to handle it. Okay, we'll give this a try. We'll give it a try for a little bit, and if it doesn't work, then we'll just put you back on audio.
Sure thing.
So we got a ton of questions already coming in from the audience, which is great. Just a quick remark just from Tim Underwood, him saying just a comment here that him listening to your talk, Maya, was a landmark moment for him. All sorts of loose ends are coming together to make sense to him and explains so much. Thank you. Intuitively, this tests out what I have been experiencing with people's reactions to things I am seeing around him. So he appreciates it very much.
Thank you,
Maya. I think probably better to just have the camera off. It's just a little bit delayed. Okay, there we go. Okay, so first question comes from Sheila Evans, and she's kind of asking a more specific question about the pandemic itself and trust in kind of these health institutions during the pandemic. And her question is how much of the problem of trust in this pandemic was due to the evolving nature of the situation at hand, when kind of urgent decisions were needing to be made about, the authorization and the emergency use of vaccines, making calls on lockdowns, just kind of out of just to be safe, essentially, to make sure that worst case scenario doesn't play out as some of the models said. So yeah, how much is this problem about trust in public health in this pandemic actually just about the evolving nature of the pandemic and how fast things can change?
There was a lot of tracking of, really good question. There was a lot of tracking of public trust in science throughout the pandemic. So there's a lot of polling on this very question. Usually, there's yearly Canadian polls, and pretty much every country in the world does this kind of thing. It's useful knowledge for policymakers. During COVID, they amped up this tracking because it was so interesting to watch how people change from month to month. At the start of the pandemic, there was higher levels of trust in science and scientists and experts than they'd seen in years. There's kind of been this downward trend for most of the 2000s, and suddenly there was a spike up. And it was sort of, maybe it was the thinking behind it was that it was this moment of shock and crisis when the pandemic was declared, and people wanted to hear what scientists had to hear. If you remember, if you think back to March, April 2020, some of our public health officers became household names. Some of the provincial level ones became kind of rock stars, not so much in Ontario, but like BC and Alberta certainly did. And it was a time when people, needed information, and they thought, and because of that, they turned to the scientists with an idea that they had something to offer that the politicians did not. So that was a good moment for public trust in science. But as things went on, of course, things did not turn out quite what we wanted. Remember, we were supposed to lock down for a few weeks, and then it would be over. And here we are 2 years later. So that sort of goodwill towards and good feeling towards scientific experts has waned. We've also seen what I would actually call a very realistic account of science that normally we don't get to see. We've seen new science evolve. We've seen public health officers have to change course on their recommendations, and that is not a sign of science going poorly. In fact, it's apparently the self-corrective nature of science is a sign that it's going well. But most people have that's kind of sort of what to call it, a kind of popular idea about science, that it is a body of facts. So when science says it, that is true. So if science changes course, that's not a sign of updating information based on emerging data, which is a sign of good information building, but rather, these scientists don't know what they're talking about. So there was a few things going on there. There was the newness of it exposed the side of science that we rarely get to see, the way new information emerges and changes. And we also got to see much more about how science and politics interact, especially looking at our provincial public health officers. You got to see that they are, on the one hand, supposed to be advisors and critics of the government for policies around COVID, but they work for the Premier's office too. And because of that, they were constantly struggling with their role. Are they here to say, yes, everything the Premier's office says is right, or are they here to deeply criticize their boss? And I'd say just about every public health officer we've had has not done that job very well. They've not been able to sort of maintain a bit of distance and cohesion with in their political appointments.
Picking up off of that, I'm going to try to combine two questions here, Maya. And actually, before I ask the question, are you okay if we extend the Q&A just perhaps a few minutes longer, just because the technical issues kind of ate into that Q&A? Is eating.
Oh, sure. That's fine with me.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, let me combine two questions, one from Gene Sissons and another from Norman McSween. Wondering if and how politics and religion have kind of influenced this crisis in trust in public health.
Politics, certainly. Religion, there were moments where I thought it was, but now I'm not so sure. I'll speak to politics first. I think that there's been, similar to what I said about the previous question, it's been surprising to many to see how science and politics mix together. And I mean, this actually isn't new, the idea that there are a lot of scientific advisors to government. That's kind of the image we have of good liberal democracies, that they actually take scientific advice and incorporate it into the policies that we have. So there is a big body of researchers and public servants who are scientific advisors to government. And because of that, we got to see that science does not stand separate from politics. The common view of science is that it is objective, it is value-free, it is removed from politics. But in fact, scientists that work for the government already are invested in politics. And when they are being asked specifically political questions, they're not just doing science for the sake of science. They are trying to answer certain questions with certain objectives. So political influence is there, and we can see how different politicians throughout COVID used that sort of, used their public health officers to sometimes hide behind their policies, to deflect criticism. The very practice of having your chief public health officer announce new restrictions to the public instead of the premier doing it themselves makes it sound like, well, it's not me, it's what science says. So the frustration about lockdown or business closures could be focused on science, even though science doesn't tell us what to do, or as in it doesn't tell us whether to close schools or not. Science can give you estimates of what will happen if we keep schools open versus what will happen if we keep them closed, but it never decided whether we need to close schools or not. So that was something that politicians use. They kind of put science in front of them as a bit of a shield and say, hey, we're just following the science. So that put the scientists in a very unenviable spot and politicized science in a way that I think will have long-term effects, not in good ways. Now, as for religion, there were the place where religion came in most noticeably around the COVID vaccines, where there were a lot of people of faith wanted guidance from their religious leaders on COVID vaccines. And there were, at some point, there were, when public health and were trying to address pockets of Canadians who were less likely to get vaccinated, they were informed by the research into vaccine hesitancy that said, not all communities trust public health officers very much. And it could be for historical reasons. New immigrant communities, racialized communities are known to be less trusting of government and of government institutions. So many reached out to religious leaders to speak to their communities, so to be sort of vaccine ambassadors. And there was very good response to that. So we actually had the leadership coming together, religious leaders coming together to advocate safety measures, patience and kindness, vaccination, and that was a point where there was a sort of a positive influence from religious leaders. I think that was probably the most visible area where religion played into the vaccine outreach and COVID response in general.
The next question, it's a question that is right from my heart as an historian, because I love to kind of situate things chronologically, comes from Karen Almaty. I'm sorry if I got that wrong, Karen. But she asks, Maya, what is the source of distrust in public science institutions? Is there, an event at a specific point in time where trust sort of began to erode? Can you kind of identify a time or at least a period in which you really start to see the erosion of trust?
There's a few historical points that are pointed to, let's say, at least in industrialized nations. Apparently there was a science heyday after the Second World War. It was a time of, the polio vaccines and new developments. And of course, at least for the Allied countries, a lot of investment in scientific progress. So sociologists and historians of a certain age will speak to, let's say, their childhood awe of going to a science expo or watching the first astronaut walk on the moon. And that was a time when there was, a lot of goodwill and good feeling about that scientific progress was going to make our lives significantly better. And, since then, a lot has been realized, and science has made our world a lot better and our lives a lot better, but there's also been consequences too. So moments like when the first nuclear weapon was deployed. That was, a major shifting point for how people saw the scientific industry, that it can be used for bad purposes too. So that's one. All the while, and since then, science just gets bigger and bigger. So I'm pointing to a historical moment, at least in industrialized nations, where big science begins, where we suddenly scientific industry got big, government investment in science got big, and we saw the benefits of it, but we also saw the harms, like the Manhattan Project. So that is probably a good starting point for where public trust starts to waver. And of course, since then, we've had things like watching how environmental degradation and things that happen from our progress, it doesn't always work well. Social injustices can actually be perpetuated by science. So that might be a historical moment that's significant. All the while, there's always been resistance to science in one form or another. I track vaccine hesitancy, and that goes back to the days of Edward Jenner. Along with the first vaccine came the first anti-vaccination league, as they called themselves. So there were people opposed to this new science right from the beginning. Science, of course, was very different in nature. Not 20th century science was were the big projects that sort of captivated attention, but science has often been unknown and perceived as dangerous, such as vaccines.
Maya, I want to give you a chance to talk a bit more about your book, because I know we talked about it briefly when we met yesterday, but I'm hoping you could perhaps give us some insight on how does the progress of writing or the process, I should say, of writing a book that becomes kind of in academic circles, and maybe I'm wrong because I'm not a philosopher, but that basically was moved into the mainstream and became such a globally pressing issue seemingly overnight. How was that process, and what did that look like to you as the author of a book that became such a pressing issue globally so quickly?
I will say that it was already a big issue, a timely issue when I was writing it. I started writing in earnest in 2015, and vaccine hesitancy among parents was the pressing issue. It, of course, didn't have the scale of COVID vaccine hesitancy because we have never tried to vaccinate the world before. Most of the conversations around pediatric vaccine hesitancy were happening in physicians' offices, so behind closed doors. It would spill out into the public, of course. Like, I remember shortly after I started my work, there was, an outbreak of measles in Disneyland in California, and it was, people were so angry. I remember, following the news and trying to get a sense of the media, and people were just like, stop this now, vaccinate everyone, throw parents in jail. It was an angry time. And of course, we were talking about a few hundred cases of measles, what we called an outbreak, a vaccine preventable, an outbreak of vaccine preventable diseases was much smaller scale than we are now. There was always the chance it could get bigger. I mean, I gave you the American case, but in Europe, we were having outbreaks in the magnitude of thousands in Romania, in France, and of course, then there is the presence of vaccine preventable diseases in the global South, just because we've done much better with distributing vaccines globally, but there's still room for improvement. And of course, then there's COVID vaccine distribution, which has been inequitable to unexpected magnitudes. But you asked the question, so it was a big issue already. I couldn't have expected COVID to happen, or I suppose global health people were expecting something big was going to happen, but I didn't know that. And I finished the manuscript in 2020, right as COVID had been declared a pandemic. So I didn't write about COVID, but I kind of bookended with a comment in the preface to the reader, just saying, okay, we've got something big happening now, and I think we're going to be I think these themes of public trust and expertise are going to carry us out into this new era of COVID, and we'll see how it plays out. So what it did was it amplified the issue. I'll say when I started doing this work, I used to have to define vaccine hesitancy for people. When they'd say, what do you do? I work on vaccine hesitancy. Oh, like anti-vax? That's what people would say. Now people actually use the term because it's become, during the time of COVID, it has become a commonly used phrase. So that's a different thing. And also the way people think about vaccine hesitancy has changed a little bit too. It used to be thought of as, a problem of white affluent mothers with too much time on their hands. And doing that was ignoring that there are many vaccine hesitators, and for different reasons, including, let's say, racialized communities that just don't trust the system. And it isn't just a problem of, rich people that are selfish or have too much time on their hands. So it in many ways, it sort of situated the sort of social context of vaccine hesitancy differently. And of course, it made my work a much more, I got much more exposure than I would have. Like I started getting media requests, and, the media never wants to talk to philosophers. That was kind of surprising to start getting those requests. And I appreciate that there was more interest in hearing humanities perspective, and rather than just, going to the infectious disease experts to ask them about, even philosophical or ethical questions around vaccines, which they are, great as they are, they're not well suited to answer those questions. That's just not their area of knowledge.
I wonder, Maya, has the pandemic challenged or reinforced any of your conclusions that you made in your book or in your previous research?
Thank you for asking that question. It has reinforced the issue that public trust is at the center of the issue. It has led me to go a little more broadly than thinking about public trust in scientific institutions. Like in my work, I frame that problem as a political problem. I said, why do some members of the public not trust the scientific consensus? Well, you can actually get an easy answer to that question by reading the literature. What do vaccine hesitant parents say? And you will hear them say things again and again, not just in Canada. I don't trust big pharma. So that tells us, and this is such a widespread view that it was puzzling to me that all the media commentary still talked about scientific illiterate people when it was the other answer was staring at them in the face. There was clear mistrust of how industry and academic research interact with each other. And I think it's an issue to be taken seriously. Whether you think vaccines are corrupted by the profit motive or not, that's actually besides the point. But you can at least recognize that the public take issue with that. So it means that there is a severe trust problem. And if you want the public on board about vaccines, you'd better address that. Also, the presence of racialized communities being mistrusting of vaccines. The empirical research on vaccine hesitant parents was almost entirely done on white people. It just wasn't seen as important for social scientists doing these kinds of survey work and measuring vaccine hesitancy. There are a lot of measurement tools for that, to reach out to racialized communities and to actively recruit. And I think that's because they were stuck in the science illiteracy thinking and a war on science problem. So when you think you already know the reason, you may not bother doing that kind of active recruiting. It was interesting when COVID started that right away, there was a lot of survey research. Will you get the COVID vaccine when it becomes available? And this time the social science researchers bothered to go into racialized communities, immigrant communities, and found out and were shocked by the finding that these communities that were more affected by COVID, higher numbers of cases, higher numbers of deaths, were less likely to get the vaccine. And that caused, a little bit of a ripple at least in media discussions about it. I would have said, we kind of knew this all along, just people didn't want to see it. So that was a bit of a change in thinking that vaccine hesitancy actually has a social history, including your trust in scientific institutions and your trust in government. So I've been challenged to think a little more broadly about the political context, because you can look at what's happening in Ottawa, for example, and say, how much is Health Canada responsible for this? And I can tell you it's a little bit there, but of course, the vaccine politics have morphed well beyond the sort of scientific issues. That was used as a foothold to bring in many, many grievances against government, against pandemic response and things like that.
Maybe we'll just do two more questions, Maya, and then we'll wrap things up. The next question comes from Katya Magarin. So again, Katya, I'm sorry if I got your last name wrong. And Maya, I know that you kind of focus on the North American context, but her question kind of looks at it from a more kind of international one, in that she asks, have you found kind of any differences between North American countries like Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and somewhere like in Scandinavia, where kind of trust in institutions are perhaps a bit stronger than they are in North America? If there is a difference between this kind of crisis in trust in these public health institutions here in North America versus, Sweden, Norway, Finland.
Yes, I pretty much governments that do a better job supporting their citizens, and Scandinavian countries are well known for that, for having excellent welfare supports and maternity leave and parental leave and kinds of things that we can't dream of. We wouldn't even dream of in Canada. They generally have better citizens. When citizens feel more cared for by their governing institutions, they're more likely to comply with directives, even when directives are seen as new and changing. So it was interesting to watch how public responded to directives at, let's say, lockdowns or things that are seriously inconvenient, as inconvenient and things like that. And there was generally a lot more willingness to comply in countries that have better social supports. New Zealand was a wonderful example of that too. Meanwhile, United States will probably be remembered as the most divided during COVID, because it played along those political lines. There was the Trump response to COVID, and then the broad Democrat response to COVID, and there was barely ability to there seemed to be no ability to find connection between the two. So yes, the Scandinavian story is a good example of how building trust in your populace will allow for things to go smoother when crisis happens. And it's a good idea to build that trust so you can bank on it during those times of crisis.
Last question for you, Maya, and it comes from an anonymous individual, so I'm not sure who it is, but a scientist nonetheless, asking, how do we as scientists, and I think perhaps even more broadly as a society, how do we kind of rebuild these institutions and regain trust in these institutions? What can be done in order to repair this kind of erosion that's taken place over, many decades?
Very good question. As some of them will be small things like I see a lot more scientists communicating with the public. I know it doesn't always go well, but scientists have made themselves visible all through COVID. And I think that generally has a positive effect. Maybe not for the scientists who get harassed on Twitter, but it has brought science out and scientists out as an important component of society. That maybe, the sort of distant figure in the white coat, that figure doesn't really seem to apply anymore. So that's a good thing. Also, scientists have been excellent about writing publicly accessible communications. Op-ed pieces and articles on the conversation are a great way to engage the public with science. And there's a lot of research into science communications that say engagement with the public is the way that you build better relationships. So ways to do that include, making things that are writing things that are accessible to the public. That's important, but also there's all kinds of versions of citizen science engaging the publics in town halls, and they have something called citizen juries in more in Europe, where you bring people in for a weekend and talk about scientific issues and policy implications. So engaging the public the same way that in a democracy we should be doing that with all political issues, we can do that with science too. So more opportunities for citizen engagement is important. And there's structural issues too. At least in biomedical research, that's my area of research as a philosopher of medicine. The worries about industry-funded research are humongous. And I see how the academic leadership wants to trivialize that concern. Oh, it's conspiracy. What's wrong with industry-funded research? That kind of thing. The publics could not be clearer that they are concerned about that. They are afraid of safety cuts along the way. We heard this about COVID vaccines, that the profit motive might have, created all kinds of reasons to skimp out on the research. And we need a lot of buy-in from the public. So all the arguments that things we could do to create a separation between industry funding and industry influence, as in just because you pay doesn't mean you get to decide what the outcomes are, need more attention. And to trivialize that as conspiracy thinking is the wrong way to approach public engagement. And it's the wrong way to think about how science and society are going to work together in a better way.
Well, Maya, I just want to say thank you very much for a wonderful talk tonight and a very engaging Q&A session. Thank you for dealing with the technical issues as well and sticking with us. We really appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you so much. I love the questions. I'm coming back just to try. I love the questions, and I really appreciated the opportunity to talk about this. Thank you.
Not a problem at all. Maya, would you be okay if some folks are interested sending their questions to me over email, and then I can forward them along to you?
Sure, that sounds fine.
Okay, that sounds great. So yeah, if anybody, I apologize, we weren't able to get to all of the questions today. There were so many good ones. But if you have a burning desire to get that question answered, please do send it along to me, and I can forward it along to Maya, and she'll be happy to answer those questions for you. Our next event, and actually is going to be our last one for the speaker series and for the 2021-22 speaker series, is going to take place on the 30th of March at 7:00 p.m. And it's actually going to feature one of Wilfrid Laurier University's own historian, Leanne Leddy, who will launch her new book, Serpent River Resistance, on how the Serpent River First Nation at Elliott Lake confronted uranium mining during the Cold War. If you're interested in registering for this event, actually we have it super easy for you. Once this session ends, you'll actually be redirected to our public lectures page, where you can click on Dr. Leddy's upcoming lecture, or any of the number of other ones that are going to be coming up at some of our partnering institutions. I want to remind folks too, one more time, that if you really enjoyed tonight's talk and you wanted to learn more, Dr. Goldenberg's book is available at 30% off. I've shared it with you in the chat, but in case you came in late and weren't able to see it, I'll share it with you one more time before I wrap things up. I've already purchased a copy, so I'm looking forward to it arriving, and for me able to read a bit more into what she's already told us tonight. Last thing that I'll say is that if you enjoyed tonight's webinar and would like to know, or would like to know what's going on at the Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada, whether it's future webinars, whether it's our upcoming conference in May, our Canadian Military History Journal, or any other events or podcasts or publications that are going to be coming out in the future, you can actually, again, in that same webpage that you're going to see once this webinar ends. You can just scroll right down to the bottom of the page and enter in your information, your name and email, and you'll get periodic emails from us of things that are going on at the center and that you can participate in. So one more time, thanks again, Maya, for a tremendous conversation. I want to say thanks to everybody for sticking with us despite those technical issues. Thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you have a great rest of your evening, and we will hopefully see everybody here again one more time on the 30th of March at 7:00 p.m. Eastern Time with Dr. Leanne Letty for our final event in the 2021-22 speaker series. Other than that, take care, everybody, and we'll talk to you very soon.